This program is brought to you by Suffolk University. Please visit us on the web at www.suffolk.edu.
For participating in this century-old program to advance free speech and an informed citizenry through public discussion. Tonight, our panel on modern Islam features two esteemed experts, Mr. Bilal Kaleem and Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Mona El-Tahawi is stuck in the United Kingdom and unfortunately will not be joining us tonight. The Fort Hall Forum appreciates our generous sponsors in the Boston community, including, among others, the Lowell Institute, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and our partners at Suffolk University, which serves as the forum's home base. We also thank all of our members, whose generosity makes this free public event possible. If you're not already a member, please consider stopping by the information booth that you passed on the way in and joining up. It's your support that keeps the forum alive, independent, and free to the public. This event, like many of our programs, is being recorded right here by our friend Sam and will be available as a webcast on the WGBH Forum Network. If you're sharing a comment or a question, please use the microphone, not only so you'll be heard, but so that what you say is captured for posterity. And please understand that by speaking, you are giving the Fort Hall Forum permission for us to record you. Lastly, if you wouldn't mind, please everyone take a minute and turn off your cell phones if they're not already off. There you go. Over the last 20 years, the topic of Islamic faith and culture has increasingly occupied the forefront of American thought as we continue to have a military presence in the Middle East. With a national security policy that is focused on extremist activity, we have yet to discover the true nature of American Muslim communities and how their religion and politics intertwine. The experts here tonight offer us a rich, informative background on Muslim issues and their relationship with democracy in the 21st century. I am delighted and honored to introduce our moderator for the evening, Dr. Jim Carroll, Distinguished Scholar in Residence at Suffolk University. Dr. Carroll received his bachelor's and master's degrees from St. Paul's College, the Paulist Fathers Seminary in Washington, D.C. After studying poetry at the University of Minnesota and working as a community organizer in Washington and New York, he was ordained into the priesthood. The Paulists and Cardinal Cushing assigned Dr. Carroll to Boston University, where he served as Catholic chaplain from 1969 to 1974. During those years, he published numerous books on religious subjects and had a weekly column in the National Catholic Reporter, which earned him awards from the Catholic Press Association and other organizations. Dr. Carroll remained active in the anti-war movement until the Vietnam War ended. He left the priesthood to become a writer and has since published 9 novels, an award-winning memoir, and a weekly op-ed column for the Boston Globe. Jim Carroll is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and serves on its Committee for International Security Studies. He is a member of the Council of Penn New England, and he served 4 years as its chair. He has been a Shorenstein Fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and a Fellow at the Center for the Study of Values in Public Life at the Harvard Divinity School. Jim Carroll is also a trustee of the Boston Public Library and a member of the advisory board of the International Center for Ethics, Justice, and Public Life at Brandeis University. And now, as I turn the microphone over to him, please help me welcome Dr. Jim Carroll.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer. My mother would be so proud of your having promoted me to doctor, and I have to begin by claiming, with due modesty, the title Mr., but you can call me Jim. Please don't call me James, because that's what my mother called me when I was in trouble. I want to acknowledge the honor I feel to be with Dr. Jasser and Mr. Kaleem this evening. We are all on the lookout for opportunities to inform ourselves more fully and more respectfully about the glorious tradition of the House of Islam, and to have these two leaders of Islam in America with us this evening is a real privilege. I'm going to say something in general about my own personal hopes for this evening. But the first thing I need to acknowledge, of course, is that I'm no expert on Islam. I'm with you here to learn. I actually do have a certain expertise in the American Catholic experience, and I'd like to draw an analogy as a way of setting our discussion. America encounters Islam. Islam encounters America. Perhaps I could suggest those brackets for the discussion that's more formally entitled Modern Islam, Engaging Questions of Faith, Fanatics, Democracy, and Reform. It matters enormously that this conversation is taking place in America, and I'm sure that that will be a point of reference for both of our speakers. The Catholic experience is very dramatic because Roman Catholicism has been transformed by its encounter with America. 100 years ago, well, hello, when I was a boy, which is most of 100 years ago, but it's not 100 years ago, the Roman Catholic Church was still very much a pre-modern, pre-Enlightenment, medieval institution. The watchword of our life as Catholics was, no salvation outside the church. That is to say, we're better than you. The world is divided between the good and the wicked, and we're the good. And you will know it when you spend the rest of eternity in a lake of eternal fire. No salvation outside the church. I had my first experience of theology when I was 10 years old, because that understanding of my place in the world and in eternity, even while it offered a certain consolation, an Irish consolation against the British, even while it offered a certain consolation, it terrified me, especially because the two people I cared most about outside of my own immediate family were Dickie Babb on one side of us and Peter Sisman on the other. Dickie was a Protestant. I knew that because he went to what we call the Protestant school, also known as the public school to other people. And Peter Sisman went to the Protestant school also, although I knew he was a Jew. All I knew about Jews was they had killed our Lord. But I also knew that Peter and Dickie were going to spend all eternity in a lake of burning fire. And it was an anguish that kept me awake in the middle of the night. So when I went to school one day and the Monsignor came into our classroom and told us that the Archbishop of Boston had excommunicated a priest for preaching on the Boston Common, not blocks from here, the doctrine, no salvation outside the church, he excommunicated him. The Monsignor told us this. I remember rushing home and saying to my mother, Mom, they excommunicated a priest for teaching no salvation outside the church. My mother said, I heard. I said, I thought that's what we believed. She said, it was. I said, what do we believe now? She said, we believe live and let live. And actually, 1953, that was a foretaste of the Second Vatican Council, where that was officially proclaimed. Father Feeney was the name of that priest, and he appealed his excommunication to Rome, knowing that Rome had to back him up, not the Archbishop. And Rome shocked the Catholic world. This is why I remember it, when it supported the excommunication, although on a technicality, that Feeney had disobeyed an order. It took no position on the doctrinal question. That came 10 years later. But the doctrine changed. Why? The Archbishop's name, he hired me as a Catholic chaplain at Boston University, was Richard Cushing. And he understood that doctrine had to yield before something else, which was an American experience of rubbing elbows with people who believe differently. And when one absolute truth rubs elbows with another absolute truth, they both begin to be understood in less absolute terms. As it happened, Archbishop Cushing's sister Dolly, who was an MTA token taker, was married to a fellow by the name of Dick Pearlstein, who with his brother ran the shop, the men's clothing shop they had inherited from their dad, whose name was Louis. And from Louis', which in those days was on Boylston Street, they used to walk into the Boston Common and they heard what Father Feeney was preaching, especially about Jews. He would have happily included Muslims at the time, but his world was not large enough. No salvation outside the church. Jews, Muslims, all Protestants, especially Catholics who are in the state of mortal sin, who are not obedient to the Pope, who think for themselves. The lake of fire, you could feel it. changed. Why? Because America enabled Catholics to rub elbows in intimate ways, even to marry them with people who believe differently. Americanism was the name of the heresy that the Catholic Church condemned in 1901. And the main principles of Americanism, freedom of press, primacy of conscience, pluralism, the idea that each person was responsible to God for doing what they thought was right, informed by the community, but primacy of conscience. These ideas, a heresy called Americanism, were affirmed as central Catholic doctrine by the Second Vatican Council, one of whose leaders was Cardinal Cushing. America changed the Catholic Church, and there are profound ways in which the Catholic Church, embodied in the Americanist John F. Kennedy, has had a profound impact on the United States of America. Two, a magnificent, fruitful dialogue encounter. America encounters Islam. Islam encounters America. It's happening. What is happening? That's our question. And we have two people wonderfully qualified as people who love this country and who represent the best of the tradition of Islam. Two people who are prepared to engage this question with us this evening. And it's my privilege to say a word of introduction about each. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Dr. Jasser is the president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, a think tank and activist Muslim organization which provides a platform for an American Muslim movement to separate spiritual Islam from the political. He is also a former U.S. Navy lieutenant commander and a respected physician currently in private practice specializing in internal medicine and nuclear cardiology. Dr. Jasser has been active in a number of interfaith efforts in Arizona, including founding the Children of Abraham, a Jewish-Muslim dialogue group. He also has been an advisor on Islamic affairs to the U.S. Embassy in the Netherlands. The Center for Security Policy honored him as a defender of the home front. The Phoenix office of the FBI presented him with the 2007 Directors Community Leadership Award. Dr. Jasser was recently featured in the films The Third Jihad and Islam versus Islamists. He is a regular columnist and contributing editor for FamilySecurityMatters.org. He appears frequently on the Fox News Channel and CNN and has been published in the National Review, the Arizona Republic, Middle East Quarterly, the Dallas Morning News, the Washington Times, and BeliefNet.com. M. Bilal Kaleem. Bilal Kaleem is the executive director of the Muslim American Society of Boston. The Muslim American Society of Boston, the largest Muslim organization in New England, operates the newly completed $16 million Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center. Mr. Kaleem received his Bachelor's of Engineering and Master's of Engineering from MIT and is currently pursuing graduate study in sociology and religion at Boston University with some coursework at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. His focus is Muslim civic engagement. He also serves on the board of the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization, the Massachusetts Immigration and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, and the Center for Jewish-Muslim Relations. He has also served as a mentor of the Somali Development Center, serving youth from Somalia. Mr. Kaleem will speak first for 15 or so minutes, and he'll be followed by Dr. Jasser. And then the two of them, with my help, will engage in a brief conversation, and then we'll have a conversation with the room. So first, Mr. Kaleem.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you and good evening, everyone. I assume these are parting gifts for us. I don't want to knock them over. I'll put it down here. Thank you for that introduction, James, though I was, sorry, I didn't mean to call you James. The thing that happens whenever you tell somebody not to do something, it's the one thing that sticks in their mind, and then they mix it up. So, but I was happy enough to continue hearing you speak with that rousing story. But picking up from the jumping off point where you laid off about Islam encountering America and America encountering Islam, what I thought to do in my prepared remarks is actually that the most helpful thing, given the short amount of time that we have for the prepared remarks, is just to kind of jump into something very specific, a case study, if you will, of something that I've been working on, given my experience more as a practitioner in developing a paradigm for Muslim minorities engaging in pluralism, engaging in democratic plural societies with specific reference to America. And I'll explain why that and how and so forth, but just to put that as how I thought it best to understand or engage that question of Islam encountering America and America encountering Islam. And then I think the broader discussion will allow us to touch on questions outside that specific presentation. As everybody has been witness to it, over the last 40 years, the number of Muslims in America has mushroomed. Though just on a side note, this idea of Islam encountering America and America encountering Islam, I mean, actually Muslims have been part of America since the beginning. Some historians even trace it to whether North African Muslim states had contact with Native Americans before the European presence in the New World. But even putting that aside, if we look at slavery, most of the slaves were taken from West Africa. And in West Africa, by historians' estimates, the percentage of slaves who came over who were Muslim were anywhere from 15 to 40%. So if you pick a number in there, it's still a high percentage, even at the lowest end. But of course, the experience of slavery, that was the first encounter of Islam encountering America. And that experience didn't leave that much of a remnant of Islam. But then you find a lot of first proto-Islamic movements and then more orthodox Islamic movements starting in the early 20th century, including the Nation of Islam, and then their transition to Orthodox Islam and so forth. But most recently, in terms of a noticeable substantive minority, it's been over the last 40 years. And American Muslims, in fact, are expected by many estimates to surpass American Jews in numbers within the next 30 years or so. And at the same time, the events of the last decade have raised the question of how these fast-growing Muslim communities will integrate into American and other democracies. And one well-worn path, certainly in America, is that of civic and political participation. And I imagine the Catholic Church's change over time also had to do with civic and political participation. But for such participation to occur on a broad community scale, the day-to-day Muslim community activists, leaders, and volunteers, in my estimation, will need to have access to a discourse that is accessible to the average Muslim person, understandable and accessible, and at the same time compelling Islamically. Thus, I find it important to consider how Muslim community activists and leaders might articulate a faith-based paradigm for Muslim engagement in American democracy in particular, but in plural democracies in general. So my experience is that I come at Islam and democracy from a practitioner's perspective. As a community organizer and as an organizational leader, I currently direct, as Jim mentioned, the largest Muslim organization in New England with almost 1,000 members, over 150 regular volunteers, serving about 12,000 people annually. And what we've done there, what my experience has been over the last 4 years, is work to bring parts of the Muslim communities that we work with into substantive relationships with interfaith, academic, civic, and political leaders. We've also substantively involved a number of Muslim communities in issues ranging from Massachusetts healthcare reform to opposing the state income tax abolition effort, to taking on, now beginning to take on rather, with the Greater Boston Interfaith Organization and others, usurious lending practices and fees and so forth, and then also anti-discrimination and hate crime issues. And then we've also run major civic engagement initiatives such as the Voting is Power campaign, which was covered in the front page by the Boston Globe, numerous candidate forums, things like that. But what we're working on now is our largest community organizing campaign to date, working with over 25 Massachusetts Muslim institutions to do house meetings, community meetings, to survey issues of concern, which are then being prioritized in the community meetings and will culminate in a 1,000-person action with Governor Deval Patrick at the Cultural Center, engaging him around those issues as our current sitting governor. So that, I thought it important to share a little bit about that background to kind of give you the framing of the context of my experience, and then to say that in doing that work, in order to successfully engage hundreds and even thousands of Muslims in that work, it has been critical for me to draw, and for our organization to draw on Islamic texts to talk about democracy and to frame and motivate civic and political involvement. And that has perhaps been, in my experience, one of the biggest features of the American experience of Islam, that it forces you to then look at your text critically and say, well, what is it that will, that helps resolve our experience here? And then so my master's research as well has accordingly focused on articulating an Islamic text-based paradigm for Muslim minorities engaging in plural democratic societies. And what I thought to do tonight is brief. It's a long thesis, but just to give a couple of the key or the main principles of that paradigm. And that paradigm is drawn principally on the Quranic chapter called the chapter of Joseph, or Surat Yusuf. And that's interesting because people might be wondering, well, first, as a side note, for those who may not already have known, Muslims take all the different prophets of the Old Testament and as well as the New Testament, Jesus and so forth, as being prophets from God as well, with the theological difference of, around the divinity of Jesus and so forth. So why the chapter on Joseph then? Well, Islamic jurisprudence holds the example of prophets other than Muhammad, peace be upon him, to be normative as long as there's no counter-instruction from the Prophet Muhammad. Thus, you'll often find Muslim activists, leaders, scholars regularly making didactic reference to past prophets. This is what so-and-so prophet taught, this is what we do, so on and so forth. So when the Quranic Joseph, considered by Muslims as the Muslim of his time, seeks a position in the government of the Egyptian king, which, and I'll explain this later, which happened to be a plural society where he is a Muslim minority, where he seeks a position as the minister over the storehouses, or minister of treasury, if you will, or Ben Bernanke's position, if you want to call it the Fed. He demonstrates a balance between maintaining a private discourse on faith, which he does with his prison companions, which I'll explain, while partaking in public life as a citizen of the land, in fact, as a public leader, all while being a faithful religious minority. And then not only that, this chapter, on Joseph, is given special prominence in the Quran because, as scholars describe it, it's the only full story of a prophetic figure given from beginning to end in the Quran. And it's highlighted by God himself describing it in the Quran as the most excellent of stories, ahsan al-qasas. And the Quran is actually in addition to having commandments and so forth, it's actually the thing that it has the most is stories. In fact, in many ways similar to the Old Testament. Now, out of all these stories, God is quoted to have picked this one as saying this is the most excellent of stories, and continues on to say that in it are signs and lessons for those who seek. And so it's a very compellingly powerful source a place to source a paradigm out of for the Muslim community. So what is this paradigm in brief? I'm just going to touch on 7 key principles in terms of what has been most relevant for us in creating a paradigm for Muslim involvement in democracy and pluralism and so forth. So the first paradigm principle, principle 1, is that pluralism and diversity are divinely purposeful. And if you look at one of the verses in the Quran, and when it describes and it speaks to mankind, actually, it says, "O mankind, we have created you into nations and tribes, from one man and one woman, and made you into nations and tribes, so that you may come to," and here is the word of interest. The word in Arabic is lita'arafu, and which is commonly translated in English as "so that you may come to know one another." Now, if any of you have studied Arabic, that root form of that word ta'arafu is arafa. And so if you were to translate arafa, it means to come to know one another. Now, ta'arafu is a type of, and I think Hebrew perhaps has this type of analog, I'm not sure in terms of the different forms of the verb. But that form, ta'arafu, is something called the mutually intensive form for the sake of a larger benefit. So what it implies is that the root word of getting to know each other, take that action, and then engage two parties in it in a mutual way, in a deep and ongoing relationship for some third purpose. And it's, to me, it's a side comment, it's a fascinating thing that these forms evolved to have such, specific connotations, and you could take any verb and stick it into that form and it'll take on that, that meaning. So, but basically that verb there is indicating that the purpose of creating this diversity is that you would be in relationship with each other in a deep and ongoing way for a larger beneficial purpose. And so this is here, a very celebration of pluralism as divinely purposeful. And then, I actually had more examples or verses from that, but I'll stick to getting to the other principles. So it's articulating, well, just to cap off there, it's articulating a purpose of diversity that goes far beyond tolerance or even appreciation, but rather calling for interaction, for cooperation, and so forth. Now, paradigm principle 2 is that the goal of Muslims engaging in a civic democratic process and doing public good is to contribute, not to convert. Now, how do we get that from the chapter on Joseph? Well, Joseph, who's an example of a normative example of a Muslim minority in a plural land, is that in prison. Now, God often in the Quran, when He describes different prophets, talks about calling them to belief in God and so on and so forth. And then usually there's an outcome given that, and then so on, he was successful or he wasn't, or these people believed or they didn't, or they were punished or not, and as any scripture would have. But interestingly enough, on the Quranic chapter of Joseph, without rehashing the details of the story of Joseph, because I think there's an analog in Jewish and Christian the narrative as well on Joseph, which was he was wrongfully imprisoned. But in the Muslim narrative, while in prison, he engages with his companions in prison, who are other prisoners who are there, and speaks to them about faith, and helps them with problems that they have. They come to him with issues, dreams that they've had, troubles that they're facing. He helps them, and he also engages with them around discussions of faith and belief in God. Now, interestingly enough, when he comes out of prison, which is another story, and he then seeks this position and helps his society and so on and so forth. Throughout all of this, going all the way to the end of the chapter on Joseph, God never shares whether, one, did his prison companions ever become Muslim, or did the society of Egypt ever become Muslim, or did people start to believe, or any of that. Almost as if to say that this is what Joseph did. He did talk about faith in his private capacity, and then he did do this large public good. But the doing of good was not conditioned upon his expectation that people would believe. In fact, not only that, it's not even important to know at the end did they believe or not. And and God doesn't share that information with them, or with us rather. Now, paradigm principle 3: strike a balance between privately discoursing on faith and being in a position of public leadership or public involvement. So Joseph's example is one that when he seeks his position of power and he's engaged by the king as a minister, and he's in this public position of leadership, he performs a lot of public services. He saves Egyptian society from famine, and not only Egyptian society, but the neighboring regions from famine. And yet, in so doing, we never find an example, or God certainly doesn't give an example, of him also speaking about faith when delivering his public duties. But God does at the same time show that Joseph did indeed put a premium, valued sharing with others about faith when engaging in his private capacity. For example, when he was talking with his prison companions, and in any number of things like that. So basically showing that the two, being a faithful person, and this is what one thing I thought I'd mention here is, people are free to believe, whether Catholics, whether evangelical Christians, whether Muslims, whoever, on not agreeing on theologically with others, and then speaking their free mind about that in their private capacity, and then distinguishing that from their public role. And so that's the example that you see even given by Prophet Joseph as a normative example for Muslims. Now, the other example that you see, paradigm principle 4, is multiply your impact. Seek public involvement, seek public positions. So you see that Joseph, and this is, obviously now one thing follows from another. Joseph sought public office. He sought that type of public power and public influence. When he was given the opportunity to interpret the dream of the king of the seven, the king had a dream of 7 starving cows, I believe it was, perhaps, someone can correct me, feeding on 7 full cows and so on and so forth. And the king was perplexed, and then he interpreted that dream for him, and then he sought a position of power after he gained the confidence of others that, hey, I'm someone, he says, as the Quran quotes him, I'm trustworthy, I'm knowledgeable, basically trying to earn that position based on capability, saying that you should appoint me given that I am trustworthy, or given that I'm knowledgeable around managing the treasury or the storehouses of the land, as he puts it, and so on and so forth. So he seeks that position. So the lesson there for Muslim civic engagement is that seeking public office is not only Islamically acceptable, but is recommended by prophetic example if it will increase your ability to make positive impact. Now, the other thing that you find there is that going beyond that, the role that Joseph seeks in his society, in his land, is not just for him to seek a position of power in order to do good and so forth, but even a larger patriotic purpose, which is that he seeks to have Egypt, or historic Egypt, the kingdom of Egypt at that time, play a role in serving the region around it. Because the Quranic narrative of Joseph has that when Joseph gets into power, and then this entire region goes into famine, even beyond Egypt, but reaching out to the other parts of the region, then caravans and trading delegations and others come, and Egypt helps save the entire region from falling into drought and famine. So you find that his role is one of trying to contribute to make Egypt, despite it being a plural democratic society, that one can say to him that, look, this is not your country, you're just a minority here and so forth. But his role is one of helping his country play a role in serving and bettering the entire region. And so by analogy today, the proper Muslim minority, Muslims as a minority as part of the civic democratic experience, is that we would want America to be that similar source of justice and in the world, and wanting that type of role and success for the country. Now the last, actually I missed one principle, and then we'll go to the last. The next is that he civically engaged in spite of injustices faced in order to mend injustice. So Joseph was wrongfully imprisoned, and then he seeks his release through whatever means he has available. He appeals to the king's wine server, and he's unsuccessful there. He appeals to another individual, and he's unsuccessful. But yet, despite that, even in his oppressed situation, he finds opportunities for good works while being in prison. And at the same time, he never tries to avail himself of means to get out of his situation that would compromise his Islamic ethics. And at the same time, when he comes out, his effort is to mend that injustice. So simply because there is injustice, so there's no reason whether whether Muslims or any other minorities, if they were to experience part of their American experiences and have concerns of injustice, that doesn't justify any other type of action that would, one, compromise Islamic ethics, or two, compromise one's desire to engage in shaping that country to be better. And then the last principle, paradigm principle 7, is to support freedoms of thought and expression. So Joseph's own experience was shaped entirely by his ability, despite the shortcomings of his society, of being wrongfully imprisoned and so forth, was actually he had freedom of expression. I mean, when he was in prison, he was wrongfully imprisoned because he was seen to be a threat to the domestic order, social order, and so forth, but not because of what he was saying, but simply because of the potential scandal he had gotten, or the wife of one of the noblemen had sought to seduce him, and so on and so forth. And so in order to maintain that social order, he was put in prison. But even in prison, he had the opportunity to speak his mind freely, and so he engaged people about faith and about any number of things. And then even when he came out and he was a public leader, we learn in another chapter in the Quran that even then, when he spoke his mind in his private capacity, he had the freedom to do so, even when he was a public figure. And how do we know that? There's a chapter in Arabic, it's called Ghafir, which in Arabic means, I believe, the forgiver. In that, when we move fast forward to the Pharaonic age, in the time of the Pharaoh and Moses, when that story is told in the Quran, what happens is, as Moses is speaking to the Pharaoh and telling him to believe in God, what happens is that it says, the Quran described it as one of the people from the family of the Pharaoh who was hiding his faith in Moses and in God, speaks up and he says, do you not remember ages ago when Joseph also spoke to us, or spoke to society, mentioned to others about faith and so on and so forth. And yet we find that there were no negative consequences for that. So in the time of the kingdom of Egypt, before the Pharaonic age of Egypt, Joseph in that society had that freedom of expression. And so that is something that he benefited from. And indeed, that in the Quran you find celebrated in other places as well, whether it's verses that say things like there's no compulsion in religion, or the very specific Quranic instruction to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, by God, that had your Lord willed, and this is a quote from the Quran, saying to the Prophet Muhammad that had your Lord willed, everyone on earth would have believed. Do you then force people to become believers? Sort of asking a rhetorical question that if God wished to have done it, he would have done it. Then it's no place for you to force people, and so on and so forth. So this, was Joseph's experience, certainly, and then you also find it in other places as well. Now, so these different principles of the paradigm provide a very powerful paradigm for me as a practitioner, and certainly I've found in working in our organization, when we frame a lot of the work that we're doing, whether it's in any type of civic engagement or democracy, not that you necessarily require a framing, but when you do frame it, you have a powerful ability to engage people, and then engage people in thinking about their tradition in what is currently in some ways a uniquely American way, but in my hope and indeed in my expectation would not be uniquely American for long. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll and Bilal, and I'd like to thank the Ford Forum for putting this together and giving us the opportunity to have a discussion about what I think is one of the most important issues in the 21st century, which is there a modern Islam? The title is Modern Islam, but I think there should be a question mark after that, because that's really the debate that we're in. And I was attracted to come and speak to you because if you look at the premise of the Ford Forum, the Ford Hall Forum, it's about free speech. It's about the ability to engage one another. And I think one of the paradigms that's been confused in this debate or in this discussion has been that somehow because Muslims are a minority, it's like looking in an aquarium. You sort of see them and you admire them and you try to lift them up and be positive, but yet there's no, somehow the discussion is Muslims versus non-Muslims. And I want to shake this up a bit and tell you that that whole paradigm is wrong. That actually you'll find that even though Bilal and I may share practice of faith, prayer 5 times a day, fasting, wanting to raise our kids in the tradition of the Prophet as far as morals and character, I would tell you that there's some vast differences in the way we view our faith and the way we view the house of Islam, as Dr. Carroll mentioned, in that I certainly, as a Muslim, teach my kids to submit, if you will, to God, and that ultimately, just as our nation is created as a nation under God, part of submission is doing everything you can, and then at the end of the day, there are bad things that happen to good people, and there's something we just can't change God's will. But on the other hand, I will never submit to the house of Islam. And that may be heresy, but I think part of what the West taught us is that we as individuals have a right to pick and choose our scholars, pick and choose our teachers. So while I may sit and recite the passage on Joseph to my children, there may be interpretations of that passage that I might differ significantly with Bilal on. And the issue today is, why are you here? What brought all of you, apparently, most of the audiences I go to are majority non-Muslim. Why are you here? What is the interest in Islam that is different from the pre-9/11 environment? And I think why we're here is because of fear of terrorism, because of national security. If national security wasn't an issue, if 2009 had not been the busiest year in threats upon the homeland and the busiest year of homegrown terror plots, I'm not sure that there'd even be the interest that we have. As wonderfully interfaith interest as there is, and as pluralistic as America is, at the end of the day, as many nations, we have our ethnocentricity about ourselves. But ultimately, we're interested in Islam and a modern Islam because the root cause of terrorism has some connection to theology. And I think the inability of organizations and individuals who are given a platform to come up and acknowledge the fact that while my Islam or Bilal's Islam may not be associated with terrorism, there are many groups, there are many ideologies that we may affiliate with or we don't counter that do not do the work that we need to do as Muslims. And I think that this problem cannot be solved by non-Muslims. I think that it's not us versus them, it's us versus us. And until we have a civil war of ideas, until we have an engagement to figure out, is there a modern Islam? And if there is, how do we get there? I don't think you're going to solve the homegrown terror problem. I think you're going to continue to wake up every day worried that whether there's another Christmas bomber, whether there's another plot as there was in North Carolina a few months ago, whether there's another, God forbid, Fort Hood. And I'll tell you, Fort Hood hit home like 9/11 for me, because I was a physician in the Navy, served for 11 years. I was on a military scholarship. If you look at the resume of Mr. Hassan, I can't even call him doctor, but if you look at his resume, it looks very similar to mine. And yet, he's the son of immigrants. What's the difference? The difference is the narrative. And the difference is some of the ideas that possibly his parents taught him about America, possibly what his environment, what satellite TV taught him about America, and that narrative was not countered. Tom Friedman had a very good op-ed in the New York Times in January that he talked about the narrative and said that one of the reasons we're losing the war of ideas is because nobody is countering the narrative in the public space. And that narrative is that somehow we are in a war as the West or as Americans against Islam and against Muslims, and that somehow Muslims need to collectivize themselves because they are threatened by the West. And I'll tell you, as wonderful as Bilal's story was, if you look back to some of the theological disagreements that we have within our community, when I talk about diversity, I'm not talking about Jewish, Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, Hindu. Diversity to me is The more important part that we need work on within the Muslim community is tolerating diversity within ourselves, which is Shia, Sufi, Ahmadiyya, Sunni, and then the various versions of Sunni. Because what happens is you have people stand up and say, this is the interpretation of this story, it's a beautiful story, and they ignore the other passages that are interpreted very differently that become fuel for a war against the West, fuel for a belief that somehow clerics should be leaders. And while that story may certainly drive the impetus of why a Muslim should give to their community, there are some of us that don't look backwards, but rather look forward. And I think that's one of the main differences between Muslims that are part of the solution and Muslims that are part of the problem. And I'll tell you, as much as I believe in the Arabic scripture of the Quran was given to Muslims in 610 to 632 AD. And it was in the context of the time. And a lot of the discussion about Islam is, I think, unfortunately looks backwards without looking forward. And a lot of the radicalism that comes from Islamist groups or those that believe in a militant political Islam comes from the fact that they want to bring everything back to the way it was in the 7th century. And they even talk about the caliphs after the Prophet as the rightly guided caliphs, which were influenced by the Prophet, as being an example of a utopian society. Well, I'll tell you, at the time they may have been somewhat modern, but compared to the America that my parents came to, I would never want to live under the first, second, third, or fourth caliph compared to the United States of America. Because our country has an establishment clause, it has a constitution and a Bill of Rights, and these are the ideas that organizations like the Muslim American Society, mosques like ISB, our mosques in Phoenix, do not talk about. Actually, if you say that in the mosque, that I don't want to, and actually I taught Sunday school for many years. And when I started to talk to the kids about these things, all of a sudden a very moderate community started to view me as a heretic, even though as far as the spectrum of Islam goes, I'm actually very conservative and orthodox in my practice. But the issue is the house of Islam believes that innovation, which in Arabic is interpreted as bid'ah, which the Wahhabis actually are the most extreme version of the prevention of innovation, believe that innovation is prohibited and they always look back. The more general type of those Muslims that look backwards are Salafis. Salaf in Arabic means those that want to imitate what it was at the time of the Prophet or the friends and the companions of the Prophet. So I would tell you that the way towards a modern Islam is to learn from history, but not to repeat history. To learn from the example of the Prophet as a moral leader, which is what I teach my children. But there was a glaring major problem with the Prophet at his time compared to America, which was he was not only a messenger of God, but he was also the head of state, and he was the military general of the community. So he wore 3 hats that today we separate in this country. And unfortunately, if you work with organizations that believe that they want to, in Muslim majority countries, put Sharia back into place, that means that those roles get mixed up. And what they do is they start creating a tendency of groups that collectivize Muslims to talk about engagement in healthcare policy and in income tax law and in many different things that I actually want nothing to do with when I go pray at my mosque. I have actually walked out of fundraisers for mosques where all of a sudden a fundraiser turned into a political speech about the policy, domestic or foreign policy. And as much as the response may be from the Muslim American Society and other groups that, well, there are other groups that do that, I might disagree with other faith groups that do that, but the bottom line is the historical context is very different. When you have groups collectivizing under faith, but yet when they go to Congress or the state legislature, arguing law based in reason, not based in scriptural exegesis, where every reasoned argument they have to find somewhere in the text that proves what they're saying is God's word, that's a very different method of argument. That's back to the time that canon law used to be argued in Europe. And the contextualization of where Islamic jurisprudence is today is where canon law was in Europe in the 16th and 17th century. So basically, it is us versus us. The clerics are teaching youth that Western society, secular society, is a-religious, is atheistic. Al Jazeera and all these other medias, the Muslim channels and others that are driven by brotherhood-type groups, or Ikhwani groups, as we say in Arabic, are basically teaching Muslims that the only way to a pure and righteous life is through one that's sanitized by clerics and approved by imams like Yusuf Qaradawi and other imams that are preachers that have tens of millions of Muslims listening to them, that actually have very many immoral things that they teach the kids. At the same time, they teach them some very deep intellectual discussions of Scripture. And what happens is that mixture is a volatile reaction. And what happens is when they excuse terrorism one place and they say, well, we don't believe in terror in America, but Israel is okay, or Iraq is okay because they're occupied. That type of exception becomes corruption. There's no moral principles that have exceptions. It's either right or wrong. Suicide cannot have an exception. It's either right or wrong. But yet, many of the mentors of Muslims in the West, such as Qaradawi, such as Jamal Badawi, who I believe has a seat on your board, and others, these are Muslims who have exceptions. They say, well, we don't believe in beating of women, but, as long as you leave your elbow close to your arm and, you don't swing, it's okay. I mean, this is medieval nonsense. But yet, this is actually the way scriptures are being interpreted. And when Muslims are given the platform to represent Islamic ideas, and they squander it, they squander the bandwidth by talking about victimology, giving stories about suffering of somebody under a king, and somehow that becomes an analogy that we compare to this country. I don't see the analogy. And the problem is that I think Muslims in many ways, especially those in leadership positions in America, are in denial. And if they're not in denial, they are squandering the opportunities they have to begin to bring Islam into modernity. I believe the faith can easily be brought into modernity, and I think that you can take any text that is based on God's word and interpret it in a way that brings it to the 21st century. And you can take passages that talk about war, that talk about battle, and say that these had a context at that time, but now our context for conflict globally is based on the government that we give our citizenship to, and no longer do we believe in jihad as a concept. But what happens is you have apologists that try to reinterpret jihad and say, well, it means struggle internally, it doesn't mean holy war, and all this kind of stuff, when in fact, globally it's been branded as holy war, whether they want to interpret it that way or not. It does mean internal struggle, but it has other meanings too. But the bottom line is the reason that term is archaic is because the rules for defining jihad are based upon the premise of the Islamic State. And unless they can begin to set aside the Islamic State, there's no way you could live in a society as a minority without being a hypocrite. Now, they would tell you that as a minority, we follow the laws of the land. Well, imagine that there's a minority living in the West that says that as long as we're a minority, we follow the laws of the land, but if we're a majority, we're going to do a bait and switch on you and change the Constitution to Sharia and change the law to something else because now we have the majority. So this is where youth get confused. And this is where there's an underlying insidious supremacism to Sharia. Now, not all Sharia, there's personal Sharia that guides the way I pray, the way I wash my arms in fasting and my prepare. There's personal Sharia that I don't think is a threat to anybody. But public and governmental Sharia that gets involved and that violates our Establishment Clause is a major threat. And I think you'll find that the majority of Muslims came to this country because they wanted to escape that. And I want to bring you back to my personal story. My family left Syria because the fascist, secular thugs of Syria had destroyed the nation. There was no longer any freedom. Assad had wiped out numbers of towns, and many of the intellectuals had just left. And my family my grandfather had been educated in London, as had my father, and they had an affinity for the West. And my dad wanted to get his medical training in the West, in America. And I was raised believing that I could be more Muslim in this country that had complete freedom to wear or dress or pray out as we want versus so-called Muslim majority countries. Now, the Islamists, those that believe in political Islam, will tell you that, well, that's because there are monarchs and secular fascists running most of the governments. Well, in Iran or in the Taliban or in Saudi, where you have the Wahhabis running the place, there are Islamists running the place. And it's certainly not freedom and liberty. And I think what has been missing is that modern Islam has not evolved because the third path, that third option, has not been available to them. In the Middle East or in the Muslim majority world, it's been a choice between secular fascism of Nasser, Mubarak, Assad, Saddam Hussein, and others, and the Islamism of radical Islamists like Hamas and Iran and the Wahhabis. There's not been an understanding of the Enlightenment process that the West went through. And I'll tell you that that's the root cause of terrorism, is that there hasn't been a third option, and that the underground, the irrigation process of the ideas in the Middle East has been missing. There hasn't been a laboratory available. And that's why I think that America is the place for the solution for modern Islam. These debates that we have amongst ourselves cannot be had in the Middle East. And when they do have them, it becomes a blip in time. You see a green revolution in Iran, you see the Cedar Revolution, where people finally start to get a voice, but then it disappears at the boots of the police. And one day it's the Islamists winning, and the next year it's the secular fascists. But what's happening in America is this debate's been very difficult to have because political correctness has dominated the discussion. And all of a sudden the word Islam is being stricken from the Pentagon's document on what happened in Fort Hood. And Muslims that come to speak give you long stories about the beauty of Islam and how misguided you are, and you really don't get any sense about where reform needs to happen. And I'll tell you that my narrative is that my family, we built mosques in Wisconsin, in Arkansas, and now one in Arizona. Now, they're not $16 million mosques because they were self-funded from this country. They were based on small $300,000, $400,000 mosques. But those humble mosques meant a lot more to us than money that would come from overseas that actually is gotten from the blood of innocent civilians in those countries and then comes over here to try to influence the West. And I'll tell you that this is the battle that's raging, and what's happening is the mixture of our foreign diplomacy coddling the Saudi government, the Egyptian government. I mean, to see President Obama stand next to Mubarak, one of the thugs of the Middle East, and say that Al-Azhar as a beacon of learning, and not realize that most of the oppression of women and under the name of Islam was being done by imams trained at that university, is just folly. Now, I understand he's well-intended, trying to say that we are reaching out with mutual respect, and this is all good, but what's happening is you're marginalizing the people that are the solution to the problem. If you don't say the word Islam, and if the government becomes those that determine who are the good Muslims and the bad Muslims, we can't have that debate amongst each other. We can't innovate. And when we innovate, we are told, and it's interesting, you'll find in Islamic history so far that science and medical science has had a rich history of innovation. But political science, art, music, philosophy has had a very poor history since the 13th and 14th century. And you'll find that that's the same time in which religious innovation stopped, and ijtihad, which in Arabic means critical review of scripture, stopped. And I would caution you that often we get into this game where we want to say, well, there's association with this group and that group. I think associations are important to know who they apologize for and who they don't. But they'll change hats overnight and the association means less. What you need to look at is their ideology. So I'll tell you, as far as I'm concerned, when a mosque starts preaching political science and civic activism and Sharia law, I get very concerned, and we either try to change it or we go to a different mosque. But if they talk about the separation of mosque and state, I think they'd be part of the solution. And I think you also need to look for, what is a modern Islam? I think a modern Islam is one led by Muslims that have moral courage to not make exceptions or tell Muslims what they want to hear, but tell them the fact that there are no excuses for there are no excuses for terrorism. It's interesting, Tariq Ramadan, who just did a victory tour around the United States and is continuing to travel around the United States, was recently asked about Imam Awlaki, the radical imam out of Yemen who drove Nidal Hassan to do what he did. And his response, I'm listening to him thinking, wow, this is sort of the rock star of Western Islam, the grandson of the Muslim Brotherhood founder, by the way. And he hasn't used his platform to reject the ideas of political Islam. When asked about Awlaki, he said, well, you have to realize I wasn't let into the United States, and that could have really, made me estranged to the West, and I'm paraphrasing. And basically, almost it was as if a reap what you sow mentality had happened because America had pushed Awlaki away from us and to the Middle East. And I think true leaders would actually say that he's corrupt, he has hijacked our faith for a political movement that's barbaric, and that he should be targeted and either captured and used as a tool to find out where his al-Qaeda connections are, and that assassination would not be wrong because we are in a state of war. And now many may disagree with that, but I think if you're going to effect change in a modern Islam, we need leaders that can confront within the faith community people like that are driving our youth. And it's interesting, groups like MAS now and CARE and others after Fort Hood put up saying we are now going to have counter-radicalization programs, and we're going to have websites that drive Muslims away from the bad ones. That's not going to work. If you want to teach kids not to use drugs, you have to give them something else. And our organization, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, the something else is an understanding of liberty. We are devout Muslims. We believe in our faith. We believe in the Quran. But the universe of our human engagement does not revolve around the Quran and Islam. The universe of our human engagement revolves around liberty and the First Amendment and the principles of Western Americanism. And I think until we can do the Brotherhood, developed organizations all over the world based on the spread of a simple booklet by Qutb called Milestones and other booklets that talked about the dominance of political Islam over the West and the recreation of the caliphate. What we need to do to counter that is to harness the resources of the West to create a Muslim liberty movement. And that's what AIFD is doing. We're creating a Muslim Liberty Project to begin to spread the ideas of Locke and Bastiat and Jefferson about religious freedom to counter political Islam so that Muslims can realize that the most pious Muslims are those that have a choice to wear miniskirts or not, to drink or not drink alcohol, to have a society that's completely open and not sanitized by the clerics. So don't be deceived by Muslims that come up and appear to be congenial and gentlemen and very polite, and yet when they go into the mosques, they're apologists. They say other things about terrorism. They blame the West. They don't take responsibility for the things that they're doing. And I think that it's very important that we look for Muslims that are going to look towards a modern Islam that are actually telling their followers and our community memes, new ideas that can begin to bring us into modernity where we can separate mosque and state. And that we understand that terror is simply a tactic and that there's a goal that these groups are seeking, and that they actually use their bandwidth to work against that goal. And they tell the Awlakis of the world that we don't want an Islamic state. We prefer an American state based in freedom and liberty where there's no establishment of any faith and Sharia can stay in the ivory towers of your Islamic universities. So with that, I hope we've addressed some of the issues. Thank you.
Well, I'll take my prerogative as moderator. Can you hear all right? Can you hear this? To put a question to each of our speakers and then open it up for a few minutes. First of all, Mr. Kaleem, is there anything in what Dr. Jasser said that you would disagree with, or a different emphasis that you would offer in your, because as I listened to the two speeches and took careful notes from both, it struck me that the interpretation and response to modernity that was at the heart of what Dr. Jasser was calling for was actually demonstrated in some important way by the interpretation you offered of the story of the prophet Joseph. Nevertheless, I'm aware of an undercurrent, and I'd like to see if we can surface it a bit. What would you say?
Well, I'd like to leave more time for the audience to engage, but I'll just remark on a couple of things. I think I would actually say that I probably agree with maybe 70% of what Dr. Jasser said, but a couple of points that I'd like to pull out to make a comment on. It would seem that Dr. Jasser himself, is not comfortable with having, whether it's political or social or other types of discourse in close quarters with spiritual discourse or in spiritual settings, and that's fine. And I think there's a lot of people who feel that way and don't want to keep the mosque part of their life or their spirituality separate from their politics, and more power to them. I think at the same time, one good thing about America as compared to European secularism is European secularism emphasizes the complete absence of religion in public life, while I think as Americans we're much more comfortable with expressions of faith, or even being forthcoming about what drives your attachment to particular values. And while many of us certainly here in Massachusetts might find a lot to take issue with, for example, the Christian right and what types of politics it informs, but I would be wary of going down the path of saying that interpreting the Establishment Clause to mean that we should be preventing expressions of faith in the public sphere, or preventing people from being comfortable in expressing that their views on social justice issues or politics are arrived at from faith, or feeling that a church or a mosque or a synagogue that preaches on social justice issues or political issues is somehow creating a pool of radicals by doing that.
What's the role of Sharia, if I may ask a question? My point is about Sharia. In a Muslim majority society, where should Sharia be in government?
That's one of the things where I agree with you. I think that there should never be a coming together of powers, military, political, and legislative. I think those, and religious. I mean, the political, legislative arm, within them there should be separation. I think we've actually arrived upon a very wonderful system of checks and balances here in the U.S. I'd like to see that exported to Muslim majority, not exported. I'd like to see that evolve in Muslim majority countries. I'd like to, and I get the most hesitant, or not hesitant, fearful when I hear about experiments with implementing Sharia, whether by the Taliban, or whether by Pakistan, or whether by Iran, or whether by now the government references in the constitution to Islam in Iraq, and so forth. Because I've seen what one person's conception of what Sharia should be, if it's within the same. Now, people who are in these Muslim majority countries, and when they're campaigning on whatever platform, if their platform arrives out of faith, if their platforms arrives out of some other place, all of it should be welcome, but none of it should be imposed upon by any religious establishment or clergy. So there I agree with you about Sharia. But I think preaching is a different thing.
Let me just suggest a different context, and forgive my Christian-centered point of reference again, but it will help me if, Dr. Jasser, you would elaborate your powerfully made point about the insistence you're making between the private spiritual world and the public world where you really don't want to see, as I understand you, spiritual principles imposed on the public realm or defining the public realm. And my simple question is, what do you make of the powerful use that Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement made of Christian theological references as points of liberation for African Americans, as an example?
Oh, well, that's a good question, and I think we have to be careful not to be ahistorical, meaning that there are certain principles, whether it's fighting hate, genocide, or other profound deviations in society in which faith groups need to come together. And that would not be wrong. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about governmental processes becoming intertwined with scriptural exegesis. And this is where it's dangerous. And I think the civil rights movement could have happened without the churches being a tool for that. It was very helpful. Certainly Martin Luther King used that platform. It's not wrong for him. I may not have used that platform, but that's my own understanding of my own product. You know, maybe I'm biased because of what the Brotherhood and others have done to so many innocent people in the Middle East and elsewhere that I'm so estranged from the mixture of politics and religion. But the bottom line is that's ahistorical, because the Islamic mindset about the mixture of politics and religion is, you know, even the separation of powers concept that Bilal just gave you is a version of political Islam 3.0, where it's still built on the same infrastructure, where that infrastructure derives the Quran as the source of law, not a source of law. Very different mentality, number one. Number two is that law, when you talk, and when I talk to an imam, they basically don't care that I pray and read the Quran. They basically think I'm an atheist or an apostate, because I don't think Muslim majority countries, communities, like when the MAS has its meetings, do you guys call your board a Majlis Shura, a Shura council?
No, we call it a board of directors.
Okay. Most mosques, that's good. Most mosques call them Shura councils because they use the concept of consensus, which is Shura in Arabic, to say that, well, this is democratic. Well, we all know in Iran's a democracy. But what it is, it's a mobocracy in which 51% of the voters become the oppressors of the society. And that what the American experiment taught us is that minorities actually have rights that can trump the majority, and that the legal system protects their rights at the expense of what the majority may rule. Why? Because at the end of the day, the Supreme Court is the final decider. And the Supreme Court's decisions are based on reason, not based on priests sitting together and saying that, well, the Bible doesn't conflict with this law, so we're going to let it pass. That's a very different concept. Let me give you alcohol, for example. I don't drink. If you believe in Sharia, you would say that Muslim majority countries should outlaw alcohol. Malaysia, even considered a moderate country, recently arrested a lady because she was Muslim and drinking. Her ID says Muslim. She was drinking a beer in public and she was arrested. Well, this is absurd. I don't think it coincides with religion. And the answer to your question is that religion is only religion if you live in a laboratory where you can throw it away, decide you don't want to practice it, do what you want with it, because it's a choice. And Judgment Day to me as a Muslim only means something if I can reject wholly, God forbid, God and His Word, or if I accept it and then I've actually made a choice. And this is the part that Sharia advocates don't get. They want to create a sanitized society. They want to create a system of laws that basically says that this is God's kingdom and we are going to interpret Sharia in a consensus way, political Islam 3.0, with separation of powers, but still the source is the Quran and not common law and reason.
Ladies and gentlemen, I welcome your questions and welcome especially succinct questions. Thank you.
Two quick ones for Bilal. You mentioned that in the upcoming years, the Muslim population in America could well surpass the Jewish population. Is that something you look upon with joyful anticipation? And if so, why? And could you please comment on the activities of CARE, which was mentioned here previously? They seem to be always in combat with somebody, trying to have somebody shut down or thrown off the air or bringing lawsuits against people. Are you positively inclined towards them or not? Or how do you stand with CARE?
I am, I guess, in some emotional way, if you will. It is good to see when there's more Muslims around, not because they're more than any particular group of people, whether Jews or otherwise. I just mentioned that as a reference because I found that an interesting statistic. But sure, I mean, if I were Hispanic and I happen to be living in Boston and there's a growing population of Hispanics, then it wouldn't be strange, not expected necessarily, but it wouldn't be strange if you feel happy that there's more Hispanics, but not because it's more than Episcopals or Jews or anybody else in that sense. About CARE, I can't comment very specifically on CARE, but what do I think about them being a very active, vocal watchdog organization? I kind of think of them as akin to the ADL in many ways, in terms of what they have set themselves out to do is really be a very vocal watchdog, and they do a lot of things that similar to what the ADL or others might do in terms of being very, by some people's estimation, overly sensitive about Islamophobia and other things like that. But I consider that part of their job. So I'm glad somebody is. I don't think every Muslim should be. And actually, that's another point that I really agree on there in terms of victimology for any group is a problematic thing. So I wouldn't want victimology to be the mindset of the average Muslim organization or the average Muslim person. But I think every minority community, at least the American experience has shows us, should have kind of a watchdog group that watches out for its rights.
Well, I think his answer to that demonstrates the problem in that rather than see the moral inadequacies of an organization that claims to represent Muslims, he wants to see them as a civil rights group. A civil rights group would stick to just civil rights, even though most of what they do includes foreign policy, domestic policy. They branch into a ton of issues. They accept foreign money. It has been shown and documented that they've done that. So there's even a question whether their foreign agent status should be looked at. So there's a big concern I have with a group that hatched out of the Islamic Association of Palestine and actually did not find a constituency large enough and ended up focusing on Islamic civil rights, even though much of their status has been in question based on their identification in the Holy Land Foundation trial as one of the unindicted co-conspirators in that trial because they had information about the network of mosques and fundraising that's done around the United States. So as much as their intentions may be labeled as civil rights, they end up doing a number of things that I think is a liability to our community and not a benefit.
Yes, ma'am.
My question is also for Bilal. You spoke of social justice, and I've
Put
heard.
the microphone right at your mouth, please.
Sorry,
Thank
can you hear me better?
Yes, thank you.
Bilal, you spoke of social justice, and I've heard leaders in the Middle East refer to peace with justice, and it sounds like a buzzword to me. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is, in a pluralistic society such as America, do you believe Muslims should be treated as equal to other religions or superior?
Equal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
You'll forgive me, I'm terrible on names, so I'll just point, okay?
This is Dr. Jasser.
Yes, Dr. Jasser, I applaud much of what you say, and I agree that Bernard Lewis wrote a book, What Went Wrong, and this was the decline. It was the stop of advancement of the Ottoman Empire when they were at the gates of Vienna, and his argument was that they didn't keep up with the West, with Europe, and the progressive advancement of science and business and everything, that they were wedded to the past, to Wahhabi in Arabia, to the Quran, to principles that were old and archaic, and They
Sir, if I may, that's actually a very useful context. Would you come to a question, please?
Yeah, two questions. One is, I think one of the great problems is the mosque versus the people, a clerical-based politics and separation of church and state, or a clerical state. I think that's one great problem. Another thing from your superb presentation, sir, is all this idealism with Joseph and his talking and his equality with other people and his tolerance and all that. 1,500 years later, after Muhammad, Islam expanded and conquered half the world and converted them from a man, and this is the man that you talk about who was so tolerant.
So let me just thank you for your questions and summarize briefly, maybe to each of you. Would you elaborate on the tension between church and state as it plays out between mosque and state?
Yeah.
Is that a fair? And then I'll ask you to elaborate on the impression that Islam spread through violence and coercion. I think that was implicit in the second part. Would you go?
Yeah, I think there's two really important points that I hope you take home. One is that there's a context within Islam in which 7th century Earth did not have an example of a country like the U.S. It took Christendom 1,789 years to develop a nation based on an establishment clause. Islam was still in the as was the world in the 7th century. There was no other example, so that was the example it had. So its basis was a mixture, and it hadn't gone through the Enlightenment. And as he mentioned, Bernard Lewis talks about that very well, about the fact that that ascendancy stopped. Much of it has to do with the militancy of the Ottoman Empire and its suffocation of universities and actually the outlaw of the Arabic language, which basically froze intellectual thought. There used to be 4,000 schools of thought in Islam, and it whittled down to 12 and then down to 8. And so this was part of the problem. But that foundation put on top of it 20th century Muslim majority countries, which included secular fascist countries that basically told their populations that they had no freedom of speech. They were imprisoned, raped, murdered if they did anything against the government. But they had some freedom of speech. Where? In the mosques. They said you could talk about politics, and the politics you could talk about in the mosques were basically foreign policy. Egyptians could not talk about domestic issues, but they could talk about anti-Semitic, hate for Israel, hate for America. That was okay. But that was allowed only in the mosques. So slowly, over the past century, the mosques became a bastion of politics, and political Islam became the animal that the secular fascists created through Hamas and other groups as an example. And when they don't like them, they kill them. When they're helping them, they feed them. And Mubarak does that all the time with the Brotherhood. Sometimes he enables them, sometimes he imprisons them and kills them. Saudi did that with Al-Qaeda frequently too.
And I draw attention to the fact that we have a number of questioners. We'll get to you all, so we'll all be succinct. Yeah. And I'd like to ask you to respond to the implication, if not a direct question. Was Islam spread in the first place by methods of coercion and oppression?
Mm-hmm. I think many times it was spread by coercion, and many times it's spread naturally. I think the history of empires over the history intertwined with faith or not has been very similar across many ways. I mean, Christianity is the largest religion in the world. I mean, I doubt it happened through roses and gifts.
Roses and gifts. It was roses and gifts, I promise you.
So I think by extension to go from there and say that then from there, for that reason, we should separate mosque and church. That's not what Mr. Jasser is saying, but I'm responding if that's the implication there.
Right.
But yeah, no, I don't think there's anything to hide as a historian when looking at Islam's expansion and find which parts were by conquest and coercion and which parts were by natural expansion.
But we do have a lot of work to do. Christendom went through a reformation in which they disavowed actions like the Crusades. They disavowed militant spread of their faith. I still think that we are hard pressed to find leading imams. Qardawi himself calls the West the land of the contract versus the land of war and the land of Islam, meaning that it's not necessarily Islam yet. It's a contract because we're a minority, which means that they may change it if they become a majority. So we have a lot of work to do on that concept.
And in the interest of making sure everyone gets a chance to address the speakers, I'm going to ask the next two questioners to come to the microphone in sequence, and we'll take the responses together. So, yes, sir, please.
Okay, it's been a very one-sided discussion tonight. There are no Islamists here to represent their views, despite your sweeping prejudices against them. But as far as contradictions go, you don't believe in moral exceptions. The United States has supported Islamic extremists like Suharto in Indonesia, like the Shah of Iran, called the Mujahideen to Afghanistan to wage war against the Soviets. At the same time, the United States has attacked with its client apartheid state of Israel, the democratically elected government of Palestine. Of course,
would you come to a question, please?
Yeah. So obviously, if you don't want to see these kind of exceptions, then the reform needs to start in the United States, and you need to face up to the fact that we ourselves are guilty of what we're accusing many Islamists either rightly or falsely of.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'll ask you to state your question, please, as a question.
Okay. This question is for Bilal. One of the 6 trustees of your $16 million center, Jamal Badawi, is on record for saying, he is in effect your boss, is on record saying, if you admit that God is the creator, then you also have to admit that he's the one who should govern. The establishment of the Islamic order, the establishment of the Islamic rule is mandatory. The evidence is quite overwhelming to the effect that you can't separate from the state in Islam. It's a totally alien idea. It has nothing to do with Islam at all. How do you reconcile what you told us today with the opinions of your, in fact, boss?
So again, I'll ask you to begin perhaps with a response to the first questioner, and I'll ask you to respond to the second questioner, okay?
Sure. Well, our mission of our organization is to fix our own problems within the Muslim community. I think to blame America as being all the problems in the world are America's, I would ask him to go to Muslim majority countries and live there and see what the Taliban did. There was no Americans pushing the sword of Talibans down the throats of other Muslims. I don't think that... I have actually been one of the most outspoken Muslims in the country criticizing our previous before 1989, our policies that actually one of the things I say is that every American should look in the mirror before they fill up their gas tank if they're worried about Wahhabism. So I completely believe, and I've been critical of this past however many administrations' support of the fact that our enemy's enemy is our friend. That is not always a good policy. It has created a lot of problems, and I do think the post-1989 environment has changed that, and I think one of the reasons why I, as a taxpayer, feel that the investment into Iraq is worth it is because we have to fix the problems that we caused by supporting a lot of those countries for as long as we did.
And Mr. Kaleem, you have a direct question put to you.
Sure. 2 parts. One, is he my boss? No, he's not my boss. Our board of directors, has 9 individuals, doesn't include him. He is on the board of trustees of the Islamic Society of Boston, which owns the Cultural Center, and we, the Muslim American Society, operate the Cultural Center fully on our own. Now, but regarding him, though, in fairness to him, if he did say that, I disagree with it. If he, whether he said it or not, I think the best way to talk about Jamal Badawi is to really look at his work, look at his writings, look at his teaching. He's a professor at, I believe, St. Mary's University, perhaps in Canada. A long time person who's been involved in interfaith work as well as Islamic teaching business, teaches business and management as well. But I think I think anyone who would look and judge his work and his teachings and his writing can come to their own conclusion about him. But as far as the ideas you expressed there, yeah, I would disagree with that. If the gist of the idea is that coming back to Sharia and Islamic law being established in a Muslim majority society and so forth.
So is the Muslim American Society doing a lot of work to teach Muslims that if they are 99% of the population, that the Islamic State is dead? Have you guys written that?
No, we haven't written that.
Oh,
That's
so,
like
so how do we believe you? You're just deflecting this question, but yet there's no positive work, one sentence in any of the Muslim American Society's works or pledges that says that you disavow the Islamic State.
I could write that for you if you'd like.
Not for me.
Well,
not for me. It shows what you're working to do.
Let me complete my thought. Let me complete my thought.
You complete your thought, but then I want to come to the public.
Yeah. Well, what I'd say is, what we focus on is Muslim civic engagement. So it's like asking an organization to do. So for example, the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. If I say, well, have you done work to actually, get out amongst lots of Muslims, youth, to engage them in ways to actually teach them the civic process so that they can, by practice and by example, feel a part of the civic process and see themselves at home and feel a stake in their country. And what are all the programs for that? You would say, and rightly so, that, well, what you're engaging in is as a think tank. It's to engage in this type of forum and discussion and share all of that. Well, what we're engaging with is all the work that I told you. For us to, expound upon, a non-expert practitioner like myself, to expound upon that in forums other than this, but to actually write something about it, I mean, it's not what we chartered ourselves.
But
Fair enough. And
if I may I cite
I'm
one?
going to ask two people to address succinct questions to our speaker.
One analogy to the Islamist State: the Russian Tsar, the autocrat who legally had religious, secular, and control over the army. I believe we all know what happened to him.
Thank you very much.
No, and the question is, if you're a heretic, who declares you a heretic, and how are you punished under Islam?
Okay, fair enough. Good, clear question. Second person, please.
One sentence premise, one sentence question. I have been astounded throughout this debate how American the assimilation that both Muslim friends have described. My question is this, after reflecting on it, Dr. Jasser brought up the principles that America was correctly formed on the principles of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Jefferson. I see a dichotomy here in this question for all three of you. Those men's principles were in essence based, for the first time in history, that men could be governed by reason, could control their own lives. As a Catholic, as a Muslim, Jewish, Protestant brothers. We, in essence, do not believe that there's a dichotomy. We believe we have to look to something outside ourselves, that I am not capable of living that way.
So,
how do we resolve that dichotomy is the question.
Thank you.
All three of you.
Thank you. Either one can start off.
Can you explain the last?
Well, I think that the question I heard embedded, the question I heard embedded in that is, what's the relationship to the transcendent in Islam? How does the move from reason, choices made based on reason, include an experience of or honoring of the transcendent? Is that fair enough? Close enough?
Only to include that I'm saying that is the same concern for Christians.
Yes, right. Yes. So.
What was the question before that?
And the question before that is how
Heresy.
How are you judged to be a heretic, and how are you punished?
I think this is the thing that Muslim groups also are not doing enough work on is, for example, the concept of apostasy. Jamal Bedawi, your Board of Trustees person, has in 2004 a statement on Islam Online, which is one of the Brotherhood's main portals out of Qatar, a statement that says that blasphemy should only be outlawed as it affects the cohesion of the Islamic State. So therefore, any criticism of Islam, he says you shouldn't do anything in the West because Muslims are a minority. But basically he's saying that if Muslims are a majority, you can start to control these things because they feel that criticizing the faith weakens he compares it to treason. And I think this is where the problem of reform and looking backwards is so problematic as far as many of the so-called Islamic leaders. And the bigger concept of heresy looks to, in Arabic, what's called takfir. The takfiris are those that, in Arabic, takfir means to say that somebody else did kufr or has rejected God. And takfiris are those that determine that, like Bin Laden is a takfiri. He says that moderate Muslims, non-Muslims, these are all kuffar, and they basically should be killed because they're atheists. And the Amman Declaration actually was a significant declaration that looked and said that takfir is forbidden. Why? Because Islam doesn't have a church. There's no communication or excommunication, and it negates free choice in religion. And I think this is one of the main things we should see Muslim groups work at, is that there's subtle takfir, which is all of a sudden Muslims that have unique, innovative ideas get marginalized. They get shunned. They get looked upon as not part of the tribe. There's a tribalism. And a lot of Western Reformation looked at recognizing individual ideas and lifting it up, even though the majority may disagree with it. And I think that's one of the things, that we don't have a church to declare heresy, but there is significant pressure within the community to dispense with heretics.
And
yeah.
a comment.
I think that's a good assessment, and I think it is one of the big problems that leads that radical groups do, this takfirism. And I think ideally no one should be declaring anyone a heretic. So I mean, I'll leave it at that. The second question, which was on the transcendental and so forth, I mean, what I took from it is, and I'll relate it to something that Professor Noah Feldman at Harvard Law School talks about in terms of this struggle between church and state, and how those of us who feel that there's something outside ourselves that drives us towards certain values, and incorporating that now in our public life, given we're in a plural society where we all celebrate the disestablishment of religion, is he sets up a paradigm of legal secularists versus values evangelicals. And values evangelicals, legal secularists, are those who would prefer to have no discussion in the public sphere of religion, and think that that's the way to help create a public space that allows different entities to, or different faiths to coexist well. And values evangelicals want to have the right to expound based on values that exist in and of themselves within themselves, whether by way of Christian values or Muslim values or Jewish values or Buddhist values or what have you. And he says that basically, I mean, if you let this thing play itself out, as long as that the anti-establishment clause is there, it doesn't matter which way people come at it, because you're only going to end up convincing by way of reason to those who don't subscribe to the same values. So it's not something to get worked up over. If it works to preach in the church on politics, but when you come out and engage, if only those who you're going to convince are other Christians of the same sect, then anyway you're going to move forward from that discourse. And so it's not something that we get wrapped up in circles. I mean, it's a more sophisticated argument than that he makes, but it's kind of a layman's rendition.
Gentlemen, we are.
And if, sorry.
Am I on? We are just a little bit over time, so if we could take these last couple of questions and then wrap up, that'd be great.
Thank you. Go ahead.
My question is to the doctor. Just a question. If everybody doesn't know, like the Quran has one version only. So the Quran I read here in my home in Boston is the same Quran. People read in Saudi Arabia, just one version. And my question to the doctor is, why are you saying that the Quran is outdated? Is that fair? Because like many of inside the text it says many events would happen, and it was written so far back as you say, but yet those events have happened. So I don't think it would be fair to say that it was kind of outdated. And that's kind of what I got from your great speech.
Thank you for your question. And madam, if you would make the last question, please.
Thank you. Dr. Jasser, one of the things that you said that really resonated for me was the concept of choice in religion. I went to a religious school growing up, and I felt more Jewish when I went to a public high school and could choose to be Jewish in my values. On the other hand, I had friends who were Catholic, and I was very happy to learn. One of the I guess the question is, how can the non-Muslim community support tolerance and the debate within the Muslim community? Because I think you're right. In the end, it's a Muslim community issue. The person who spoke before me, the Quran would not be out of date. Devil's always in the details and the interpretation. And the part that has changed in Judaism, at least, is that the rabbis are all arguing about what it all means. What are the chances and what can be done to support that view of Islam and bringing it into the 21st century?
So both questions directed to you, Dr. Jasser, and then I'll invite Mr. Kaleem to say a last word.
Thank you. I'm glad the Muslim gentleman asked the question, because I would never want to be misinterpreted that the Arabic Quran is outdated, all of it. I will say that there are passages, and what I was talking about is certain passages that refer to battles that happened at the time, need to be put in context, and that they were relevant in the 7th century and are no longer relevant now. And you can't start looking at battles based between religious communities and trying to extrapolate that into today's world. And this is one of my problems when Muslims talk about increasing number of Muslims and da'wah, which in Arabic means, they interpret benign as being education, but it actually means evangelism. That process, I don't really, I believe in my faith, and I dream of my children practicing Islam strongly, but I think we're beyond that in this world today. I think that if people want to learn about faith, they can. It's not my mandate to go around evangelizing Islam. This is no longer necessary. I think that there are a lot of resources for people to do that. So there are things that we need to look forward to, but I do believe, I am taught, and I do believe that the Arabic scripture is God's word to the comma, and that the only thing you'll find that all Muslims agree on is the fact that the Arabic scripture is God's word. Lastly, about choice in Islam, her question gives me the opportunity to, there were some cards we put on some of your chairs, if you could fill them out and communicate with us and give us sort of feedback about where we can work together and build networks of change to try to bring these ideas to Muslims you know, to Muslims you may be in contact with, to business community, government, to universities, because this is a movement that has to happen from within. And it can only happen within if the Muslims that are sort of in the woodwork, in the business community, in the law and medical community, that don't go to mosque all the time, that aren't part of the lowest hanging fruit where you look up Islam in the yellow pages and you find them, but they're actually more in the community, those Muslims we'd like to connect with, and please do that, because that's how you need to give us a platform to have these debates, and we really appreciate it.
And Mr. Kaleem, a last word from you.
Well, first, I think forums like this are an excellent help, both for Muslims to begin to engage, because I think there are a shortage of forums where Muslims of varying opinions get and engage with each other in helpful ways that help each of them grow. So I think that's one helpful way to do things. And I think by way of comment on just the talk of the evening is that I would invite folks who are interested in learning more about Islam and democracy, about the very practical examples of what we're doing at our center and so forth, to come. It's an open community space, and you can come as you are and really see what we're about by direct engagement, as opposed to a lot of the back and forth that goes on about us by others. And the last comment to Dr. Jasser, yourself, and others is one of my biggest worries is that we try to cut off our, as they say, I hope I get the expression right, cut off your ear despite your nose type of thing, because a part of the undercurrent of today, it seems, is that perhaps you and I can't work together. My biggest fear would be is that if you and I can't work together because of worries about what we think are the implications of some things that are taken as buzzwords and what I may have said, or what I think you may have said, then that's a much bigger problem. Because I think, I wouldn't have a problem with most of what you're saying, despite the differences that we teased out here. And I think the problem that we have is that what we are against is much larger or much more clear. Now, whether you feel that our emphasis isn't directly taking that on, and I feel that you're neglecting actually engaging with the community and proactively doing something as opposed to always being against something. Regardless of that, I still feel we're trying to do in many ways a similar thing. So that's my kind of last observation on that.
And I will sum up by saying that we began by asking, how does America encounter Islam, Islam encounter America? We've had a really magnificent answer to both questions with this stirring, intelligent, civil, and quite pointed conversation. I want to conclude by thanking Jennifer Bernardi for organizing this event and saluting the people at the Ford Hall Forum for maintaining the great tradition of this lecture series. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Jim.
Thank you all. If you're not a member already, please pick up an envelope on your way out or find us on the web at fordhallforum.org.
This preceding program was brought to you by Suffolk University. Please visit us on the web at www.suffolk.edu.